Doc Soros here. I wanted to just give you some feedback. Thank you to everyone that purchased the DMT Ayahuasca frequencies. That's fantastic. A lot of you that purchased them or are in the process of purchasing them sent me a bunch of questions. And so what I've done is I've tried to compile some of the most important ones. It's like if you've already got the collection, where you're thinking about getting it, how do you get the best use out of it? So I'm just going to go through some really quick bullet points. If you have any other questions or if there's something that I didn't address, just let me know. So the first question is, how long should we use them for? Just a few minutes, or in a loop, or mixed with more tones? Okay, so that's a really good question. There's a few questions actually in that. How long should we use them for? A lot of the stuff that you're going to be doing with this collection should be in line with our general usage policy. So on our website you'll find a how to use section. Generally that applies. So if you've used our tracks before, make sure that you've read up on that. There are some things that you should be aware of from the general usage framework to get best usage out of this collection or any of the other ones. There is a bit of a difference here though, and I think it has to do with the potency. The strength level of these tracks is fairly high. I definitely noticed it when I was developing them. So I'll come back to the length in a bit here. I'll talk a bit more about that. But the person asks, should it just be a few minutes, or in a loop, or mixed with more tones? Okay. So we found historically in the past that some users are very sensitive. And what we've tried to do is come up with an average working mean. It's interesting because as we're discovering this through the work, and we post our findings, we find that other people that are kind of like New Age, ufologist, scammer types, they like to lift our content and then attach it to whatever they're doing and say, oh well, use these protocols. Well, the protocols came from us because we were actually doing the work. We didn't just heist it from someone else's website because it sounded good and we put it on. But what I'm going to say here is that per our regular usage, looping should probably be the best for most people, unless you're really sensitive. Some people that are really sensitive that use our frequencies don't fit easily within what we tell the general public or the average person buying and using our frequencies, which is usually 45-minute on the minimum, 3.5 hour on the maximum average. And so the reason for that is that what we found over time in application is that for most people it's right around 45 minutes that you begin to really notice something happening, where it's like you're very aware that there's something going on, and it's usually between 45 minutes and 3.5 hours in that window where there's a peak. So people have come up with different ways of describing what that peak is like, but it's basically where the signal is probably the strongest and it's having the maximum effect on your current state. And that's what you're generally aiming for, that's what you want. And then they ask, should it be mixed with more tones? Usually I would say for most of our tracks, feel free to mix these with non-chaotic background music. So types of music that blend well with our frequencies are anything from ambient, electronica, nature sounds, techno, some techno. If it's something that's kind of clashy, like heavy metal, or hard rock, it's iffy because then it starts to, blunt or mute some of the signals. If you've got something that's like fine, medieval Baroque music, that usually embeds well. They go together well. For the DMT tracks, I'd say experiment. If you want to use other tones, other SOS tones or background music, you can give it a shot, but what I would do is I would set it so that whatever else is going on, that the threshold of the other frequency or the other background sound is at least, it should be at least 1 to 2/3 lower in volume. So you don't want it to be the dominant necessarily. If you're going to sleep and you want to try to experiment with lucid dreaming with the frequencies, then certainly you can play with that. You know, if there's some cool music that you like to listen to before you go to sleep and you want to put the DMT ayahuasca frequencies on at kind of like a below the threshold, sub-threshold to the background music, you can experiment with it. But I'm just saying as a rule, with the DMT frequencies, I put them as the primary or the dominant signal. So coming back to the time spent. So what happened with me when I was developing this is I very much fit in the average user category. So, I mean, there's some tracks that I'll notice an effect really quick. Usually for me, I've found personally over time, it usually takes a minimum of about 45 minutes before I notice something. And I tend to peak at about roughly 2 hours in. So, the problem, or I won't say a problem, but the issue here is these are new. We've been getting good feedback. They're stronger than I had anticipated they would be. So I think that it would probably be a good idea for everyone to kind of step cautiously and slowly. So for the average person out there, I'd say keep the volume a little bit lower, keep the time exposure a little bit lower. I would even say, you know, as you first start out, the max that maybe you want to play any given track would be an hour. Just ease into it, see how that goes. Another question is it harmful to use them too often as in daily? So my response was, we have never had any reports of harm from SOS usage. Members have reported discomfort, mild discomfort, and things like fatigue from overuse. Any sound could be theoretically uncomfortable or cause some degree of jeopardy if overused, played too loudly, etc. My suggestion here would be to also consider the question of, would you want to take the actual substance daily? Could DMT ayahuasca taken too often daily cause any problems? Consider that these tracks do actually have real properties of the substances embedded within them. I would suggest starting off with moderate dosage, slowly build up exposure time and volume, also slowly over time, and observe how you are feeling. To date, all SOS tracks are safe to use within usage specs provided. These tracks are entirely experimental and are provided only with the SOS disclaimer provided. Prior to use, you need to be aware of and agree, of course, to accepting your own responsibility of outcome as per the disclaimer given. So I'm just going to talk about that. It's like any sound can be, you know, potentially harmful. I mean, but there's some really simple things that you should go by. Don't play the sound too loud. I mean, you wouldn't play any sound, whether it was SOS frequencies or a song, past the comfort level. Like you shouldn't be experiencing any kind of discomfort or pain from any sound that's going on in your environment. So just make sure it's within comfort threshold. The other thing to consider here too is that we have seen in past situations where some users really liked a given frequency or a collection, and so they played them a lot, and probably what happened was they liked the results they got, so they just wanted more and more of it. But understand that this is basically an energetic information signal that's being absorbed by the body. And like a battery, I mean, you can overcharge a battery, right? And so what we've seen is that people that repeated the signal over and over again, you know, way past like what they should have been, you know, would report that they felt tired, they felt sometimes a little bit achy, and likely what's going on there is it's just too much energy too quickly. And so to avoid that, just slow down the dose, you know, slow down or lower the volume, and, you know, just play it less. That's basically how it goes. But the other thing too is use some common sense. Like, I think most people would agree that it wouldn't be a good idea, you know, to use ayahuasca or DMT every single day, or, you know, take copious amounts of it. So, you know, you want to pay attention as per that. Now, the other thing about listening, there's a question. Okay. So the next question is about earbuds versus headphones. or without earphones? I use my AirPods, but are they as effective without earphones? And so my response, I strongly suspect these tracks should be good performers with or without earphones. The convergent style tracks are likely to perform better with headphones. So let me just explain that. You'll recall from the previous video I talked how this collection, we have 33 tracks in this collection approximately now. And they're broken into categories, modules, themes. One question was, how do we tell which module is which? So when you're looking at the categories of the 33 files, there will either be a prefix. So in the case of the convergence tracks, I believe there's 5 or 6 of those. They'll have the prefix CNV. And then, the ones that are for silent delivery will have the coil prefix. So if you're using like a wearable or, a stationary electromagnetic transmitter, if you're using a coil, something that you're using basically as a transmitter, then in those cases, of course, the coil tracks will work best. And there's a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is just that we found for SOS, it seems as though tracks that are in a narrower spectrum of tone ranges seem to perform better, just generally. That's not always the case. I mean, there's some exceptions to that. That's just what we've generally found, and we found that some of the tracks that are very rich and having like a very broad spectrum of tones, they seem to perform on average better through acoustics. So for the convergence tracks in the DMT series, I'm going to suggest give it a try. If you have especially if you have a high quality type of headset. I have a suspicion that you'll probably get better results from that. But that's not to say that full body immersion, because like a lot of our SOS tracks, we find that when there's full body immersion in the acoustic signal, that's been where we've had the greatest peaks. So I know, like for myself and for other people, like the richest experience tends to be when there is a kinetic vibration coming from the signal. You can feel the pulse in your body. But because of the nature of these tracks, I think they could probably perform quite well with high quality headphones. Next question, I have participated in several ayahuasca ceremonies and they usually last several hours. Is it possible to achieve the same experience? And so the response of that in general that I gave is that most people are not likely to have the same comprehensive style of experience or at the same intensity. We do, however, expect that qualities of an actual DMT ayahuasca experience are highly likely with the majority of users. This may very well include sensory stimulation, psychoacoustic body-mind effects, hypnagogic visual imagery, hallucinations, emotional intensity associated with DMT ayahuasca-style trips. Then I said as a side note, I noticed during development of these tracks after listening for only 30 to 60 seconds that the effects seem to linger for up to about 20 minutes after, from what I can recall. There could be a longer effect envelope from the average use. So part of what's going on here is that, and I want to explain this, I suspect that I'm probably one of the only people out there in this, whatever you want to call it, industry, that takes the approach that I do, where, especially, like, if somebody commissions like a substance simulation, like, to my mind, like, you kind of have to, if you're going to do it well, you've got to approach it from multiple angles. It's true, some of the substances that we've emulated have evoked properties in some cases very intensely in a positive, beneficial way with users. But when you're representing something as complex as DMT or ayahuasca, I think there's like an importance to understand, what the technology in the public domain can bring and how does it compare to the actual substance. So it's really important to understand that the actual substance is a composite thing, right? So it has lots of different properties, lots of different attributes, and it's experienced when it's, say, for example, ingested or smoked, drank, where there is a convergence of these properties happening essentially in the same moment. So when we're modeling with frequencies, typically what we're doing is we're trying to model either one particular characteristic, or in some cases it's better to model multiple characteristics. And then the hope in the latter case being that if you model more characteristics, then the body will more easily and readily identify the substance as the thing that it's being modeled after. That's the premise. But one of the constrictions, one of the constraints that we have to operate in, when we take a look at just the tech and how is the average person set up, the reality is that we're delivering either an acoustic or electromagnetic signal sequentially over time. So all of the information, for instance, that's in a 10-minute track, it's not all happening at once. The body isn't experiencing even the entire frequency as an information envelope all in the same moment. What's happening is information is being fed and then absorbed in sequence, on one plane in a linear fashion. And then, of course, we do suspect that there's a higher end state or a higher order of dimensional experience that's probably occurring. Certainly we see that in the design process, but the point I'm trying to make is just that one of the reasons that we say, not for everyone but for most people, it takes time and repetition for the signal to have an effect, is because through recursion of the signal, or the repeat of the signal, we're causing entrainment, right? So, because we're dealing with resonance. So anytime you see any physical system that's moving into a state of resonance, it's moving usually into a state of resonance over a period of time. So a certain amount of time, a certain amount of energy is required to build the resonant, state up. And so this is why when you play the frequencies, we have these thresholds where, like, how long does it take, until that signal is absorbed. So imagine if you took DMT, or you smoked it, or whatever you did. You've got all that information from all these properties hitting you right in the moment. But that doesn't happen with the frequencies, typically. What happens is bits of information are being transmitted and then received and then absorbed, and then the signal or the pattern is building up over time. So, given that, some people, again, were asking about the mixing of different frequencies. What I would suggest is, especially if you've had limited experience with SOS, start off with the Convergence series. Start off with that one, do it acoustically, see how you feel. And then, the other modules, like the coil versions, they're kind of more geared towards, more senior members, people that are doing their own experiments and they want to sort of gauge effects. And then, in the case of things like the coil frequencies, mix them if you want to in other situations. But if you take a convergence track and you loop it, I would say loop it for a minimum of 4 to 5 times. And I would say when you're starting off, if you're going to loop it with any other tracks, keep that limited to 1 or 2 at the most. I think that, again, because these are new, we're still getting in, like, the feedback's been good. It's in line with what we were hoping for, maybe a little bit better than we were hoping for, which is, it's nice after having put in that effort. But what I'm saying is just, like, go slowly, go at your own pace, and if you're going to loop more than one track, just keep it down to maybe 1 or 2. Honestly, I would say start off with a single convergence track, loop just that track for a minimum of 45 minutes. So I hope that answers the questions. Thanks again to everyone for your support. This is Doc Stars over and out, and I'll be in touch soon.